My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the envelope. It felt heavy in my lap, not because of the paper, but because of the weight of everything inside it: the folded copy of the check, my signature faint in the lower right corner, the number that represented almost every dollar George and I had saved for decades. In the back of the sanctuary, Bishop Sullivan's voice filled the rafters. He was talking about generosity, about the power of giving to change lives. And then he said the words I had not expected to hear. "An anonymous benefactor has made this possible," he intoned, his voice sliding across the congregation like warm honey. "We will honor this heart by naming our new facility the Sullivan Community Center." I remember the applause first. It sounded like a single wave, rising and breaking over the room. It sounded like belonging. It sounded like erasure. That morning had begun like every Sunday for as long as I could remember. 6 o'clock. Coffee strong as bedrock with a thin dusting of cinnamon. George used to complain that I put too much in, and he always laughed when I called it his Sunday tonic. I put on the navy suit he liked, the one he always said made my eyes stand out, pinned my pearl brooch the exact way he taught me, and tucked the envelope into my old leather purse. My Buick rattled its way down Maple Avenue. The church bell was still tolling when I stepped out. We'd been members of St. Matthew's for 50 years. We baptized Rebecca here. We buried her here at 26. And later we buried George. The bishop had stood at my side at both funerals. He had a way of making a hand squeeze mean something holy. He had promised then, with his big hands and steady look, that this congregation would be my family. I believed him. When Elizabeth left me her savings a year ago, the decision took less than a breath. The committee had been trying to finish the community center for years. After the meeting where Bishop Sullivan announced cuts, I sat in his office and said what I had to say. "I'll make up the rest," I told him. "But I want to do it anonymously. For George and Rebecca." He blinked. His glasses caught the light. "Martha, are you sure?" "Absolutely," I said. I watched his mouth tilt into that practiced, pastoral smile. He stood, came around his mahogany desk and took my hands. His palms were warm. "It will be handled," he promised. "No one will know." For weeks I watched the church prepare from the edges. They told me I should not attend certain meetings. "To keep your anonymity," they said. Sandra Mitchell, who runs the Women's Society, smiled at me as if conspirators had a special look. I nodded and let them move me to the back that Sunday, a request that landed like a pinch. 50 years of sitting in the third pew, and now I was in the last. I felt very small. The sanctuary smelled like polished wood and lilies. The choir's harmonies were close and bright. Banners hung where old hymn numbers once did. I clutched the envelope inside my purse and felt the paper's ridged edge through the leather. When the bishop announced the gift, he spoke of humility and hidden acts. He spoke with such assurance that for a moment I almost believed I'd made the right choice. Then he named the building for himself. "The Sullivan Community Center," he said. He smiled as if the name were a sort of confessed virtue. The congregation cheered like a family recognizing its patriarch. My throat tightened. I could feel every eye not at me but past me at the stage where he stood. Dorothy Williamson leaned forward and squeezed my hand as if she knew what joy I should feel. "Isn't that wonderful, Martha?" she whispered. Sandra's painted nails tapped an impatient rhythm. I felt like I was watching my life being captioned by someone else. When the hymn began, I rose because everyone rose. The wooden pew under my knees creaked in a way that reminded me of the years George and I had sat there together. My feet moved down the aisle as if remembering old routes. I don't know how I found the strength. I only know I stopped in front of Bishop Sullivan, and I put the envelope on his lectern so the light hit the corner of the check. "You might want to see this again, Bishop," I said. My voice was low. I watched the expression fold across his face, surprise, then something colder. He picked up the paper. For a beat the room breathed in. The color drained from his cheeks. There was a small, animal movement behind his practiced smile. No one applauded. For once, the choir was silent. I felt the years of our shared life press into my chest like a weight that would either break me or make me stand straighter. I turned and walked out. I could hear the whispering swell behind me, the rustle of pages, a chair scraping, a name passed like gossip. I didn't stop to listen. I had given what I could not wear as an apology for everything I had lost. I had asked only to honor George and Rebecca in private. I had not asked to be invisible. 6 months on, the new plaque on the building reads Davis Sullivan Community Center. My name sits next to his, carved in brass, as if compromise could fix betrayal. I don't go to St. Matthew's anymore. Sometimes I drive by in the afternoons. I sit in the car and watch the workmen hoist ladders. I watch children run in the yard. I let the car idle and listen to the muffled sound of a congregation releasing its breath. I still make my cinnamon coffee on Sunday mornings. I still put on the Navy suit. The brooch still glints. I learned then that charity should not demand a spotlight. But it also should not be claimed as a shadow belongs to someone else. We gave with memory and grief and love. When I needed my own name to be remembered, I found I could make a small noise. That noise was enough to change a plaque. And to remind me that silence, too, can be a form of courage. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the envelope. It felt heavy in my lap, not because of the paper, but because of the weight of everything inside it, the folded copy of the check, my signature faint in the lower right corner, the number that represented almost every dollar George and I had saved for decades. In the back of the sanctuary, Bishop Sullivan's voice filled the rafters. He was talking about generosity, about the power of giving to change lives. And then he said the words I had not expected to hear. My loves, thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending a little of your precious time with me. This channel is still taking its first steps, and every new subscription is a lifeline as we try to reach our first 1,000. If this story touches you, please click subscribe and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd really love to know. The week before that Sunday felt like it was made of small, honest things, the ones that keep a life steady until it doesn't. I remember the light through my kitchen window that Thursday morning, the pale winter sun cutting across the linoleum in a bright strip. It touched the edge of the enamel coffee pot, warmed the chipped cup George had left me, and made the pearl brooch on my dresser wink like a single honest eye. I fixed my coffee the way we always had. Strong with a whisper of cinnamon. The smell filled the room, pulled me into memory. George's laugh toward the back of my mind, the way he'd call it Sunday tonic, came up like steam. At 73 I moved slower than I used to, but I still kept the rituals. The suit George liked waited on the chair, navy and neat. I smoothed the lapel with the heel of my hand and thought about how much of our life had been lived in that suit and in that church. 50 years is a long time to put your shoulders under the same roof. We baptized Rebecca there. We mourned her there at 26. We buried George there too, and Bishop Sullivan had been the one to press his hand into mine, as if his grip could stitch up the hole. I was on the building committee for 3 decades. I knew names on every roster, the rhythm of the fundraisers, which hymn would summon more pocket change. The community center had been our promise, a place for after-school programs, ESL classes, a warm meal for someone cold. For years, the project lived in minutes of meetings and in the battered ledger that sat open on the committee table, its pages edged in dust. On the shelf above the altar, there was a small wooden cross carved by some long-gone member. Its grain was worn smooth where hands had rested. That cross always caught my eye. That week it felt like a measuring stick. The Tuesday meeting where the bishop announced cuts is etched into me. Rain laced the windows. The committee room smelled of wet coats and stale coffee. Bishop Sullivan sat at the head of the table in his fine suit, the light catching on his episcopal ring, his voice steady. The ledger lay between us like a patient animal. When he said the words, "We'll have to scale back," a hush landed. Faces folded. Sandra Mitchell, who always smelled faintly of powder and had nails like tiny flags. I'll make up the rest, I told him. The words surprised me because they came out calm. Maybe it was that calm you get from doing a thing you know you must. But I wanted anonymous. For George and Rebecca. He blinked. I could see the flash of interest at the edges of his eyes, the bend of his mouth that had soothed me at 2 funerals. He took my hands like he'd taken them before. Like he was fixing something with a touch. It will be handled, he said. No one will know. After that there were small, odd changes. They started telling me I should not attend certain meetings, to preserve anonymity. Sandra gave me a conspiratorial smile that didn't reach her eyes. A banner appeared in the vestibule, colors I hadn't seen there before, coral and gold, and the choir began practicing hymns with a swell that sounded too big for our little pews. The altar had a single tall candle lit during practice, and the cross on the shelf seemed suddenly more illuminated, its polished face reflecting the bulb's circle. A fold in the curtain behind the pulpit caught light like a mouth waiting to speak. At home, I folded the copy of the check into the smallest crease I could make and slipped it into an envelope. The paper felt like a thing alive in my hands. It held more than dollars. It held George's overtime pay from years at the factory, the coins Rebecca had given me from her first job, Elizabeth's savings from a life of careful thrift. It held apologies and birthdays and all the quiet Sundays we had thought would always be there. I pinned my brooch on because some habits are prayers. I tucked the envelope into my old leather purse, the leather softened by decades of my hand. Driving to St. Matthew's that Sunday, the bell was already tolling. The church smelled like lilies and polished wood. The scent almost exactly like the way grief had shaped our family home years ago. I sat in the third pew for half a heartbeat, the place where George's knee used to bump mine during the Amen. For 50 years that place had been ours. But the morning felt altered, like a hymn with the wrong note. Small things had shifted before the big one did. An empty pew near the front had been draped with a reserved sign, as if someone were already claiming space. The choir's soprano leaned into each note with a practiced flourish, the organist's cuff glinting as he raised his hand. I understood then that the stage was being set, and that sometimes settings are chosen to tell a story different from the one you carry in your chest. I had given that money as a quiet promise. I had imagined the center as a place where names might blur in service, where the needs would be met and that would be enough. But as the curtain at the front caught the light, and the cross winked, and the reserved pew waited like a claim, I felt a small, steady unease that would not be soothed by hymns or by the bishop's practiced words. I folded my hands in my lap and let the weight of the envelope remind me why I had come that day, and why I would not leave without being seen. The word anonymous hung in the air like incense, sweet and masking something else. When Bishop Sullivan said it, his voice filled the sanctuary, warm, sure, the sort of voice that makes people lean forward and believe. The applause that followed was immediate and loud, a single rising wave that swept the room. Felt like being pushed under water. My hands were in my lap. They were cold and damp despite the warmth of the Sunday. The envelope rested against my thigh. A small rectangle of paper that somehow contained the weight of a life, 30 years of paychecks, Elizabeth's careful savings, George's overtime. I could feel the ridge of the check through the paper, the faint loop of my signature. My fingers traced it without meaning to, like touching the edge of a photograph. Somebody laughed, high and pleased. The choir swelled. The organist's cuff flashed as he lifted his hands. The lilies on the altar smelled bright and almost sharp against the warm woodiness of the pews. I had sat in this church for 50 years. The smells were familiar as a quilt. On Sunday mornings memory arrived in scent. When he said, Sullivan Community Center, the sound in my ears changed. It stopped being applause and became an announcement. The name landed like a stone on water, and the ripples reached me. Heat rushed to my face. My throat tightened. My breath came shallow, whole body braced, as if waiting for a blow that had not yet come. I wanted, then and there, to sink into the cushions and be swallowed up by the choir's second verse. I wanted to convince myself that I had done the right thing by staying hidden, by making the gift about service, not about my name. That was the promise I had made to myself the night I wrote the check. Quiet in honor of George and Rebecca. But the quiet had been hijacked. Someone had put another voice on top of it and called it justice. Flashbacks arrived quick as shutter clicks. The rain-slick Tuesday when he announced cuts. The committee table with its ledger like an open mouth. The warmth of his palms when he took my hands in his office. So assured, so much faith wrapped in a practiced gesture. "It will be handled," he'd said. I believed him. My belief felt fragile now, like thin glass. I felt small in the back row. For 50 years I'd sat in the third pew. Sandra Mitchell's hand on my shoulder had been a pinch meant to steer, to smooth things over. "The bishop asked," she'd said, all soft edges. I'd gone. I told myself anonymity was what George and Rebecca would have wanted. I told myself the center mattered more than a name. But there is a difference between choosing to be unseen and being erased. Dorothy leaned forward and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright, proud. "Isn't it wonderful?" she whispered. Her voice was full of joy, and I could feel the betrayal in that whisper like a dart. Sandra's painted nails tapped the hymnals with an impatience I suddenly knew the meaning of. My heart beat fast. There was a knot at the base of my throat that would not untie. The skin of my hands prickled. I tasted the metallic edge of anger at the back of my mouth, the old kind that comes with years of injustice left unresolved. For a moment the only sound I could make out was my own breathing, short and uneven, and the distant hum of air moving in the vents. I pictured George's hands, broad, calloused, always warm when he took mine, and Rebecca's chipped-toothed smile from a summer she'd spent washing dishes for a restaurant. Everything that check represented flashed in bright, impossible detail. Late shifts, thrift store birthdays, pennies collected and saved for a purpose. I had not given that money for the glory of a man who could take it like a banner. I had given it to make space for people who needed one. Decision is a thin place between two heavier things. On one side, the vow to remain anonymous, to let the good stand separate from the giver. On the other, the knowledge that silence had become a cloak for someone else's claim. To speak would pull at the seam of the community we'd all promised to be. To stay silent would allow a theft of truth. My legs moved before I had decided how to feel. Feet that had walked down this aisle beside George, that had bolted at Rebecca's funeral, walked now with a determined slowness. The wood under my soles creaked the same way it had for decades, each step carrying years of habit. I stopped in front of the pulpit. He looked up, his smile steady for a heartbeat, then something altered it, tiny and sharp. I felt 50 years of names, of baptisms and funerals, of whispered secrets and potlucks, press into my chest until it steadied me. I laid the envelope on the lectern and let the corner of the check catch the light. My voice, when I spoke, was low enough that only he could hear it first. "You might want to see this again, Bishop." He took the paper. For a single suspended second, the sanctuary inhaled. The color left his face in a way that made him look suddenly small. Somewhere behind us, the choir's hymn faltered. The applause turned into a ripple of confused murmurs. I stood there, hands quiet at my sides, and felt the room watching as if it were a held breath. My hands trembled so badly the envelope slipped against my palm. It was the kind of shaking that starts in the fingertips and then spreads like cold going through winter clothes. The check inside made a small familiar weight, the sum of George's overtime and Elizabeth's careful pennies, all folded into a rectangle that felt like a heart. Behind me the sanctuary sang along to the organ, and Bishop Sullivan's voice floated over the rows, warm and certain. He spoke of unseen generosity, and then he named the building after himself. The applause rose like a tide. It washed over faces I'd known for 50 years, faces that had dined at my table, shared casseroles during winters, whispered condolences at funerals. The sound should have felt like home. Instead it felt like erasure, a blank stamped over what I thought I was doing in secret for the people we loved. When he said, Sullivan Community Center, something inside me tightened. I felt heat rise to my neck, to the backs of my hands. The smell of lilies and polish pressed against my throat like a memory. I pictured George's rough palms smoothing the collar of his shirt and Rebecca laughing about saving every dime she could. They were the reason I'd written that check. They were why I wanted silence, a small private gift to keep their names in my heart. The decision to stand up came without argument. Old habits are practical things. They know the routes of a body that has walked this aisle through baptisms and funerals, through potlucks and pledge drives. My feet moved on muscle memory until I was in front of the lectern. The choir kept singing as if nothing had changed. Their voices hit the rafters and ricocheted down my spine. I laid the envelope on the pulpit so the corner caught the light. The paper made a pale square in the bishop's hands. He looked up at me, the practiced pastoral smile for a single beat. Then something very small and sharp slid across his face. I could see the wheels turn. His fingers tightened around the paper like a man whose script had been unsettled. "You might want to see this again, Bishop," I said. My voice was low. I had learned over the years how to make things land without yelling. There was no accusation in my tone, only the plain weight of truth. He lifted the paper and read. For an instant, every sound in the room folded. The hymn faltered. Someone's cough hung like an unanswered question. I watched his expression narrow, then flatten. The color went out of his cheeks as if the light itself had left him. His mouth made a shape of surprise, not the surprise of a man delighted, but the quick small animal surprise of someone caught mid-exit. His hands moved before words did. He smoothed the check as if it had wrinkles. He blinked slowly, a man buying time. I saw Sandra's gaze flick away, a practiced avoidance. Throat cleared, face arranged into a neutral mask. Her nails tapped a rhythm on her program, a little staccato that spelled impatience. Dorothy's grip on my hand was tightened into a question, not an answer. Around us, the congregation's applause had died into a low rustle, a shifting of hymnals, the soft scrape of a chair. The sound of people rearranging themselves to understand something that had shifted under their feet. He told me my name then. Not a thank you but a small, clipped Martha. The sort of thing people say when they are trying to fit something unpleasant back into their tidy narrative. For a breath I thought he might speak honestly, make a crack in the polished surface. But the next movement was smaller. His jaw worked, and he looked away toward the altar as if searching the cross for permission. All those years of handshakes and hospital visits and punctured grief, they compressed into a flat, cold line under my ribs. I thought of George's laugh filling the kitchen, of Rebecca's chipped mug left in the sink, of Elizabeth's finger-worn checkbook. The money wasn't just numbers. It was the shape of our life together. I had not given it for a plaque or a public bow. I had given it to be a seed. Silence grew heavy around us. A woman a few rows back began to whisper. The word anonymous was passed like a coin between mouths. I could feel the church watching me as if I were a window suddenly opened to show a private room. I held my breath for a moment and let out a small sound. Not a sob but something like exhalation, a letting go. He folded the paper back, his fingers pale against the ink. For once, the polished voice that had comforted me at funerals seemed to misplace its melody. I saw a flicker of calculation, the way a public man measures the cost of a truth. He cleared his throat. He leaned forward, hands on the lectern, and for a second I thought he would say my name aloud, would draw this thing into light and own it like a shepherd might his sheep. Instead, a small tight murmur moved through the pews as if the community could not quite decide whether to follow him into that uncertain place. I felt my knees buckle with the sudden exhaustion of standing against years of polite omission. I turned. I did not wait for his thanks or his denial. I left with the ordinary dignity of someone who has had enough. Outside the air was sharp and cold. The bell tolled slow and steady and different. I walked to my Buick with my coat wrapped tight and the brooch at my throat a small familiar weight. For a long time afterward I drove by the construction site and sat in the car with the engine idling, the heater ticking, watching workmen set ladders against the new brick. I watched children dart past the fence with sticky hands. The plaque on the wall now reads Davis Sullivan Community Center. Two names pressed together as if compromise could smooth a rough seam. I don't go to St. Matthew's anymore. Some Sundays I still make my coffee strong with a whisper of cinnamon, and put on the navy suit George liked. The brooch still catches the light like a private witness. I learned that day that anonymity is a fragile thing, and that silence can be a kind of courage, but so can a small clear voice. Standing in that aisle with the weight of the envelope and the years behind me, I found my voice. It was enough to change a plaque. And just as importantly to remind me that I could be seen. After that Sunday, the world at St. Matthew's shrank around me until it fit neatly inside a whisper. At first it was small things. A program folded over my seat at coffee hour, a casserole delivered and left on the stoop instead of handed to my hands, the way the hospitality table seemed to rearrange itself so there was always someone between me and the food. I told myself people were awkward. I told myself time would smooth it out. But the awkwardness became pattern, and then it became a wall. Phone calls that used to come every Wednesday, Sandra's check-in about the bake sale, Dorothy's reminder about choir practice, a committee member's clumsy question about a meeting, stopped ringing. If I called them, my voice bounced off polite silence. Messages went unanswered. Once I stood on the church steps on a Thursday afternoon, hoping to see someone who would smile the way they used to. The doors were locked. I waited until the custodian drove up, and he looked through me like I was a shadow. He told me the meeting had been moved. He did not offer to tell me when. People began to look at me the way one looks at a cloud that might break. I slid away. Conversations in the pews folded closed as I passed. The choir, which had always nodded hello in the coffers between hymns, held its line. At the fellowship hall, the long table where we'd eaten potluck dinners for decades now had a small empty place left as if to remind me that I had been excused. The familiar chairs, Dorothy's cushion pattern, Sandra's neat stack of napkins, remained in their places, but the hands I once reached for were occupied. Sandra's smiles hardened into something particular. The smile of someone protecting a delicate story. When she did speak, it was clipped careful. We had a lot to arrange, she told me once, her voice polite as china. Everyone did what they could. There was no question in it. There was no apology either. When I tried to talk to her about the way things had been handled, she pressed her agenda to her chest like a shield and turned away. Later, I overheard her on the phone, her voice small and urgent, asking a neighbor if they had heard anything about that woman. I felt like a story being footnoted out of a book I had helped write. Dorothy, for all her warm eyes, stopped sitting in the seat next to me. At first she was late to services, then absent altogether. Once I saw her through the stained glass as I sat in my Buick across the street. She left the building with her hat tipped low, avoiding the courtyard where I used to walk with her at coffee hour. When our paths crossed at the grocery store, there was a small, ashamed folding of her hands and a look that asked for forgiveness without asking for my attention. I understood, and I did not force her into awkwardness. Grief makes people choose sides the way storms make trees bend. The children, who had once scrambled onto my lap at the Christmas pageant and accepted the cookies I wrapped with a tissue, were shepherded away by parents who said, "Not today." Volunteers who once phoned to ask if I could help with the ESL class reached out to the new coordinator instead. Invitations to church dinners arrived with polite notes that read like excuses. One invitation was left under my doormat, formal and perfunctory, as if whoever wrote it worried their handwriting would betray them. Rumor braided with fact. People tried to make sense of the scene by turning it into explanation. Some said I'd wanted the spotlight. Others said the bishop had been so central to the project, to the fundraising, that naming it after him was only natural. A few knitted the story into gossip about money and motive. None of it mentioned the nights I had lain awake thinking about George, and there were tiny cruelties. A volunteer meeting that I'd chaired for 30 years went forward without me. A birthday casserole I had promised for the bereavement team was never asked for. When I ran into the bishop in the grocery aisle months later, he offered me a small measured nod. His eyes were quick to move away. He said, "Martha." It was a name pronounced the way one announces a fact, not an apology. The church bulletin printed a short, formal thank you in a paragraph where my name appeared among a string of donors. It felt like someone had thrown a coin into a well and called it closure. I could have sunk into the quiet that everyone seemed to expect. I could have allowed myself to become the woman who drives by and watches the swings painted by other hands. But small acts kept me steady. I continued my Sunday ritual of coffee with cinnamon. I washed George's old mug and set it on the counter like a small argument against vanishing. I took my seat in the Buick across the street sometimes and watched children run, and I let the sound of laughter that was not mine be a kind of consolation. Isolation grew and tightened like a knitted cuff, but it did not define me. The house was quieter now. The brooch still caught the light at my throat. When I stand in the kitchen and look at the little dent where George used to rest his hand, I remember why I gave what I gave. I remember the weight of a promise. The community reacted the way it needed to understand itself. I reacted the way a woman who had lived through loss and love for 50 years could, with a small firmness. People close doors for many reasons. Sometimes it is fear of awkwardness. Sometimes it is fear of truth. And sometimes it is simply habit. I have learned the rhythms of all three. The doors around St. Matthew's may have closed for me, but I have not stopped opening mine. I still invite the memory of George and Rebecca to sit with me at the table. I still speak their names aloud, if only in the kitchen where the light hits the counter like an agreement. And when the workmen hang the last plank and the children's laughter settles into a new pattern, I will watch and I will know. The small voice I raised in that aisle mattered. It made a place for something honest to be carved into brass. And that, even if some hands refuse to meet mine, is enough. My hands are shaking so badly the envelope almost slides from my lap. The paper feels like a small, dense heart against my thigh. The copy of the check folded twice, my signature faint at the corner, the number that holds a life. Bishop Sullivan's voice rolls through the sanctuary like warm honey, every syllable vibrating against the rafters. The sound echoes, and the sound presses. He speaks of hidden virtue, of humility, of the quiet work of love. Then he says the name, Sullivan Community Center. The applause rises like a tide. It crashes and covers. For an instant I can only hear the sound, the wooden benches vibrating under the weight of 50 years of Sundays. The lilies on the altar smell brighter, almost sharp. I taste metal at the back of my tongue. My throat tightens. I fold my fingers together so hard my knuckles blanch. I breathe shallow, counting in my head 1, 2, as if the numbers can anchor me. I had chosen silence for a reason. For George and for Rebecca. I had wanted the gift to be a small thing between my memory and the people who would use it. But silence is not the same as erasure. The name drops into the room like a stone. The ripples reach me. Something in me folds, then straightens. The hymn rises, the organ swells. I stay seated at first, hands interlaced, feeling the paper's ridge under my palm. My fingers are a practice stitch of calm. Until they are not. The calm tilts like a plate. My legs move without asking permission. Habit finds the route down the aisle. The wood under my soles creaks in the old rhythm, one step, another, and each creak is a small bell of memory. Rebecca's baptisms, George's wider shoulders, funerals where Bishop Sullivan had stood beside me with comforting hands. A light near the altar flickers as if the room inhales. A single candle guttering, then it goes out. The flame dies soft, and the wick smells faintly of smoke. It is absurd and terrible, like a promise being snuffed. At the same moment the small wooden crucifix on the shelf trembles, loosens, and tips forward with a soft thud against the polished wood. The sound is almost polite, but it leaves the air changed. A side door in the vestibule creaks as someone shifts. It is a background snap that makes the hush deeper. When I reach the pulpit, the lectern feels warmer than I expect. The varnish smells of old wood and prayer books. I lay the envelope down so the corner of the check catches the light. The paper rustles, a tiny human noise that seems too loud now. Bishop Sullivan looks up. For a moment his smile is the practiced pastoral smile that soothed me at 2 funerals. Then it falters. I see the color leave his face, just a little, and something hard moves behind his eyes like a shadow passing. My voice comes low, almost private. You might want to see this again, Bishop. The syllables land in the space between us and hang there. The choir's note stumbles. The organ holds one chord too long and then falls silent. The congregation inhales as one body. He takes the paper in his hands. His fingers are steady for a beat. Then they are not. The corner of the check peeks out, the number visible if one looks. I watch his jaw work, a small human thing, and I think I can see him balancing 1,000 tiny scripts in his head. The sermon he'd planned, the narrative he prefers, the image of himself as the benevolent leader. For a second a flurry of calculation crosses his face, swift as a bird. Around us sounds rearrange. Someone's cough becomes loud. A program drops open. Dorothy's hand tightens against mine, urgent and warm, and I feel the pressure of her fingers asking me a question I have already answered. Sandra Mitchell's painted nails tap the edge of her booklet. A small, sharp metronome of irritation. Murmurs begin to braid through the pews like a tentative tide. He looks at me and says my name, only the one word, Martha. Clipped, measured. The tone of someone attempting to fold an unexpected fact back into the neat script of the morning. There is no honest gratitude there. There is an attempt at control. I hold his gaze. I am steadier than I felt 3 breaths ago. The shaking in my hand slows and then stops because I decide it will. For a moment the sanctuary is suspended. A held breath. Light strikes the brass of the microphone stand and scatters a thin band across the hymnals. The crucifix lies quietly face down on the shelf, a small obvious bruise in the room's calm. The candle is merely a blackened stub now. Those little failures of setting feel like signs, like the world revealing a seam. He clears his throat, that practiced sound of someone finding the right note to sing from a page he knows by heart. He leans into the lectern, his voice trying to reclaim warmth. We are grateful to. He begins and the sentence hangs in phrase. The words are soft and careful, like paper being folded around an uncomfortable truth. Around me, faces are rearranging themselves into new stories. Some look surprised, some embarrassed, some already protective. A few will whisper that I wanted credit. Others will murmur about leadership and how appropriate a name can be. None will know the exact weight of the check in my hands, the late shifts George worked, the pennies Elizabeth saved. None will feel the particular ache of long devotion being captured and renamed. I breathe in. The smell of polished wood and lilies and cold air fills my lungs. My chest is steady now, not because the room is any kinder, but because I have chosen to be seen. The hush cracks into a dozen small sounds, whispers, a chair scraping, a program flipped closed. The moment is done. The room will not be the same after this. I will not be the same. I turn and walk back down the aisle. Each step echoes, carrying with it the small stubborn truth that a woman who has been faithful for 50 years is not, finally, a ghost. The candle's blackened wick and the fallen crucifix will be swept up. The sermon will move on. But the shape of what was done, the place where silence met misappropriation, has been opened. It will not be stitched closed without seeing the seam. The moment I laid that envelope on the lectern, time bent. For years the church's rhythms had been the metronome of my days. Hymns, handshakes, casseroles passed slowly across folding tables. But when the corner of the check caught the light, Something in the carefully staged morning unraveled. His smile flickered. The choir faltered. The organ held a single chord that didn't resolve. "You might want to see this again, Bishop." He didn't confess. He didn't apologize. He fumbled. He smoothed the check as if that would flatten the truth. But the check was a thing made of ink and numbers and signatures, evidence that does not bow to convenience. It showed the gift plain as daylight. There was a ledger, a number recorded, a bank trace, little procedural trails the church had to respect once pointed at. It was not a courtroom drama. It was the gentle, inevitable pressure of a community noticing that the story it had been told did not quite match the ledger. In the weeks that followed, the parish office filled with quiet, serious conversations. "We need to be fair," someone said in a meeting I was not invited to. "We can't ignore this." There were phone calls I did not receive and there were others I did. I learned the odd geography of institutional embarrassment. Names rearranged, plaques reordered, minutes amended. There were a dozen small human compromises, signatures added, a line in the bulletin that read like contrition. The brass on the new plaque changed. They put my name beside his. Davis Sullivan. 2 names on a plate side by side, the same letters, the same weight, as if that would smooth the rawness of the day. Compromise, yes. But also a correction. A recognition. That was more than I had expected when I tucked those tired dollars into an envelope. And yet correction did not mean acceptance. After the service, the church narrowed. There were dinners where my place was politely held for me in form and not in feeling. Phone calls thinned until they stopped. Sandra's smiles became formal and quick. Dorothy began to drift away from the coffee hour where we had once shared recipes and small griefs. People who had brought casseroles to my door now left them on the step. Invitations arrived folded like afterthoughts. I am 73. Grief and dignity have taught me to measure losses not only by what goes silent but by what stays. I could have been crushed by the quiet. Instead, I let small rituals hold me. The cinnamon in my coffee, the navy suit folded on the chair, the pearl brooch that catches the light in the morning. Each Sunday I would drive by the construction and sit in my Buick with the heater ticking, watch the scaffolding and the steady workmen, watch the children tumbling in the yard as a new life took shape in brick and mortar. Seeing my name on that plaque felt like a small private victory. It did not unring the wrong that had been done, the audacity of a man so used to being center stage that he could claim a gift as a coronation. But it gave me back a piece of myself I had tried to give away in quiet. There is a certain dignity in being visible for the reason you choose to be visible. A stubbornness that says, "I will not be erased." Sometimes a young mother pushes a stroller past the fence and looks up at the sign. I watch her fingers trace the brass, and I imagine her child learning to say the words of a song inside those walls. I think of George and Rebecca then, of nights of overtime and chipped mugs and Elizabeth's quiet thrift, and I feel the sum of all those small lives settle into something like peace. The center will be used by people who have nothing to do with our quarrels over credit. That was always the point. There are Sundays I miss the church body and others I do not. I miss the warmth of hands at funerals and the awkward comfort of casseroles, but I do not miss being reduced to a footnote. I learned something I had not intended to learn at 73, that anonymity can be a sacred thing, but so can speaking up when silence becomes a veil for someone else's claim. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet step down an aisle, the placing of an envelope in a hand, the decision to make the private public. The plaque reads Davis Sullivan now. My name sits there in brass, cool and unmoving alongside his. I will not go back to the pew where my knees used to press into the wood beside George's. I will, however, keep my Sunday ritual. I will cook the cinnamon coffee, pin the brooch, and drive by to watch children climb and learn. I will let that small stubborn fact remain. I gave with my whole life in mind. I did not give to be invisible. Standing in that aisle, with the paper warm against my palm and the congregation holding its breath, I found that my voice could cut through a polished sermon. It was enough to change a plaque. and enough to remind me who I am. Some endings are quiet the way a door closes. You hardly hear it, and then you know the room has changed. I still make the coffee the same way, strong with just a whisper of cinnamon. It is a small ritual that speaks louder than any sermon. I pin the pearl brooch that George liked, the one that catches the light like a small witness. I drive the Buick down Maple Avenue because old routes hold memory like a fist holds a stone. The Davis Sullivan plaque is on the brick wall now. Brass letters, neat and practiced. I saw it for the first time from the driver's seat. The sun hit Martha Davis and Robert Sullivan the same way, cold and flat. My fingers rested on the steering wheel, the leather worn where George used to grip it. For a long moment I simply watched, children darting between cones, a man with a tape measure laughing at a foreman's joke, a woman pushing a stroller half-turned toward the playground as if making sure it wasn't all a dream. I do not go inside the church anymore. I have not since that Sunday. The pews remember me, but people do not. Sometimes that absence sits like a physical thing at the nape of my neck. Other times it feels like the space behind a pressed flower book. Necessary, clean, oddly tender. There was a Friday in late summer when the workmen had left early and the yard smelled of cut grass and paint. I parked farther down than usual, under a maple tree, and walked up the path. My steps sounded ordinary, shoes on concrete, but the echo surprised me, like hearing an unfamiliar voice in an empty room. The doors were propped open for a delivery. No one looked up. A smell of sawdust and coffee drifted out. I walked across the threshold. It was the act of stepping in that mattered, not the time I spent. The foyer was cooler than the afternoon. Light fell in a thin stripe across the tile, and dust motes made slow galaxies in it. The sound of my shoes on tile was small and intimate. Everything in that building bore the mark of other hands. Banners hung with the tidy pride of people who had labored to make something beautiful. The cross above the altar looked unchanged, and for a second I felt as though any of the old mornings might step forward and clasp me in a Sunday. I did not take a seat in the third pew. Instead I walked straight to the back, where wood had smoothed from 100 knees and my name sat still in my bones. I ran my fingers along the edge of the pew. Cool varnish. A small nick where someone had once carved a heart decades ago. The place smelled faintly of lilies and old hymnals, and beneath that, something stubborn and human. Coffee. An empty hymn book lay open, the page folded to a number I'd sung 1,000 times. My hand hovered over the margin where someone had penciled a note long ago. My palm felt the grain of the wood and the rhythm of all the Sundays stacked under it. Baptisms, meals, grief steamed away by casseroles and prayers. I knelt not out of ritual but out of habit. My knees remembered the contour of that bench. For a moment I let myself be the woman who had loved this place into being. The committees, the bake sales, the late night signing minutes. I closed my eyes and placed my hand over the place where my brooch had often caught light on the sleeve of my blazer. The building was not blame or solace. It was a house of weather and people. The plaque on the outside meant something: recognition, correction, a brass compromise. It did not mend everything. It could not stitch back casseroles that had gone elsewhere, or conversations that cooled into silence. But names on brass are not nothing. They are a record. They are a small, stubborn truth. I stood and walked the aisle out toward the door. The church creaked in the soft way old things do when they settle. As I passed under the arch I looked back once. The sanctuary held its breath like the moment between verses. The sunlight through the stained glass laid colored patches across the floor. Blue and red and green. They moved slowly as the day moved, changing shape but never losing the way they softened the wood. Outside, a line of late wind came down the street and tugged at the corner of the bulletin board. It smelled of cut grass and rain that might come. I closed my umbrella and felt the world be ordinary again. Cars in the parking lot, a child's laugh, the distant bark of a dog. There was an empty bench by the sidewalk where people sometimes sat to tie shoes or feed pigeons. I sat there and folded my hands over my lap. My brooch warmed in the sun. A bus hissed by and left a faint scent of diesel. Someone pushed a stroller past and looked up at the plaque, tracing the letters with their thumb. I did not go back inside. I did not need to. I walked away with my steps measured, my footsteps faded into the distance. The wind closed the door behind me. The world went on. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that something might begin. My hands still remember the weight of that envelope. Even now, when I reach into the old leather purse, my fingers find the thin ridge where the check was folded, like a scar you keep for the shape of something that changed you. The Buick steering wheel has the same worn patch where George used to rest his palm. The coffee still steams the same way on Sunday mornings, strong with a whisper of cinnamon, and the brooch still catches the light the way it always did. Small, stubborn, honest. After I laid that paper on the lectern, the sanctuary changed. You could feel it in the way the choir's note faltered, in the hush that fell when the bishop read my name. Faces that had been family unspooled into a dozen private conversations. Sandra's smile thinned until it was almost a seam. Dorothy's hand squeezed mine and then slowly loosened. People who had brought casseroles and sympathy to my door now passed me by, as if proximity might stain them. The parish office rearranged titles and minutes in careful, embarrassed motions. They added my name to the plaque because they had to. And because finally a paper trail had been pulled from an envelope into light. Seeing Davis Sullivan carved into brass was a strange small kind of justice. The letters were cool beneath my fingertips when I first pressed my thumb against them, and for a moment the sharpness of betrayal softened into a different shape. Recognition. Not everything mends with a name on a wall. You cannot smooth over the weeks of quiet absence, the casseroles left on a stoop, the way friends stop calling. But names matter. They hold stories. They refuse to let a life be told by someone else's version alone. I learned quickly what institutional shame looks like. Not the roaring scandal you see on television, but the slow, polite erasure that happens when a community chooses an easier story. There were meetings I wasn't invited to, explanations that were careful and empty, and a dozen small slights that added up. The bishop's hands, which had once held mine at 2 funerals, became practiced instruments of pastoral distance. He said my name like someone reciting a line he wasn't sure how to include. His smile snapped back into place like clockwork. People forgave him with the same speed they forgave a wrong they preferred to forget. But I did not leave my intention in the dirt. I had written that check for George's overtime and Rebecca's chipped mugs and Elizabeth's quiet thrift. I had tucked it into the fold of memory because some promises are private, until private becomes a cover for someone else's claim. Standing in that aisle, it took more courage than I expected to place the paper on his lectern and let the truth be seen. It was less a performance than a reclamation, a small insistence that what we keep should not be rebranded without our consent. Afterward, the world narrowed and opened in strange ways. I stopped going to St. Matthew's because attendance was not the same as belonging anymore. I didn't want to be a footnote in someone else's story. Still, I drive by the center some afternoons. I sit in the Buick and watch children chase each other between cones, sticky hands and loud shoes, and the pure, ordinary joy that makes a building worth more than any plaque. I watch workers lift a ladder, a foreman laugh, a mother push a stroller and trace the brass with her thumb. That sight calms something in me. The center exists for them, not for the speeches that built it. The days after the announcement taught me about small mercies. A contractor waved as he passed. A kid tossed a paper airplane that landed behind my windshield. Once, a woman I didn't know nodded when she saw my brooch glinting and mouthed, "Thank you." It is astonishing how a tiny gesture can feel like a treaty after silence. Those little human connections kept me from becoming a story you could file away. Time does something useful. It softens the edges without changing the facts. The plaque is there. The community center hums with life. I do not expect everything to return to how it was. People do not always make the choices you hope for. They cling to narratives that comfort them and avoid the awkwardness of truth. But I found that truth has its own stubborn momentum. Once you hold it up, even for a breath, it resists being folded back into someone else's tidy sermon. I keep some rituals. Coffee, the navy suit, the brooch. Small repetitions that are neither defiance nor apology, only the shape of a life sustained. I have learned to accept that love and grief can be private and public at once, and that you can give quietly without being willing to be erased. There is a difference between humility and invisibility. It took me decades to name it. When I think of George and Rebecca, I think of the way their names sound in my kitchen in the morning, in the clatter of plates, in the whisper of this old house remembering laughter. The center will hold children who never knew our family, but will feel the weight of what we gave anyway. That was always the point. So I keep my Sunday ritual. I still watch from the Buick sometimes, the heater ticking, the world moving on. I let the laughter that is not mine fill the car and the empty cup beside me. It comforts me to know the money I gave is doing what it was meant to do. Some secrets belong in the quiet. Others need a breath to be kept honest. I chose that breath. I refuse to be erased. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.